Hello crafty friends. Last month I asked if you had any stencils in your stash and a whopping 98% of you said you either had some or were intending on getting some, and 83% of you said that you had some but you didn't use them nearly as much as you'd like to. So I thought I'd do a series on getting the most out of your stencils. I do have a playlist full of videos about using stencils in paper crafts and card making, so do check that out as well. But in today's video, we're going to do some dry embossing and some heat embossing using stencils, and I'll also show you some other ways of using stencils to create a similar look. To start with, I took a piece of pink coloured cardstock and I placed it on my rule of thirds grid where it would sit on an actual card, and I used this to help me position a circle of smooth white card. I wanted it to sit about a third of the way down an actual card front. I stuck that down with some tape runner. And then I dusted the whole thing with anti-static powder because I wanted to do some heat embossing. But before I heat embossed, I dry embossed with my stencil. So I used washi tape to attach the pink cardstock to a stencil. I then ran it through my die cutting machine with the embossing sandwich. Before removing the stencil though, I blended on some embossing ink using a sponge blender. Once I was happy with the coverage, I removed the stencil and then sprinkled over some Wow Superfine White Pearl embossing powder. This is slightly translucent, so when you heat it you get a nice white pearl finish, but you can still see some of the colour of the card through the embossing. So by first dry embossing this panel, I get a nice raised pattern in my cardstock, including the white circle, so the whole thing has some raised circles on. And then by heat embossing on the raised circles, I get some extra dimension, plus obviously the lovely pearl shimmer and shine. To create a little bit of extra interest and depth on my panel, I went around the outside with Festive Berries Distress Oxide. I blended it on with a brush very lightly, and it just gives that little vignette feeling, a slightly darker edge. I did take a microfiber cloth and buff this ink off of the embossing. For this card, even though it's got a really bright, shimmery, shiny panel, the focal point is definitely the white circle. So I wanted to add to my focal point, and to do that I took some silver thread and I wound it round my fingers to create a kind of nest or a scribbly thread circle. I then added some high-tack white glue to my white cardstock circle and stuck the bunched nested thread down. I chose silver because I felt it would work really nicely with that pearl. I then die cut a butterfly out of some silvery metallic paper. This was one of the papers I bought back from Japan. I stuck that in the bottom left of the circle, added a body that I cut from the same cardstock. For my sentiment I chose a Hello die cut. I think this is a Julie Hickey foilable. And I added some White Blizzard Nouveau drops to the butterfly's body just to give it a bit of substance. And I love how this card turned out. I really like the bold pink, and I like the subtle shimmer and shine and the silver of the metallics. And here's another card panel that I made using the same technique. So I took a piece of green card. I used a white die cut Christmas tree and a star snowflakey Christmassy stencil. I dry embossed, then heat embossed again, and to heat emboss I used a Wow embossing powder, Hint of Blue. It's a translucent embossing powder and you get that hint of blue on darker cardstock. So on the Christmas tree it looks very pale, but on the darker green cardstock it looks quite blue. I went round the edge with, I think, Pine Needles Distress Oxide. For this panel I took a light blue cardstock and a snowflake stencil, dry embossed and then heat embossed in Hint of Blue again. I did add some extra blending to the white focal point area, and used a pale blue for this. And I think that just brings out the snowflakes a bit more on that larger white area. For this next background, I used a white star die cut and a star stencil. I dry embossed, then heat embossed in shimmering pearl embossing powder from Nuvo, I think it was. And I went around the outside of the panel with some wilted violet distress oxide. Before I go though, I thought I'd show you some other ways of adding that pearly finish to your dry embossing. For this example, I dry embossed with the stencil, then I added some indigo blue gilding gum, which is a kind of glue, and I added this with a sponge dauber, and before it had a chance to dry, I sprinkled over some very fine iridescent glitter. I didn't get much glitter sticking in the body of the circles, but I got a lovely glittery ring around the edges of the circles where the glue, or the gilding gum rather, was a bit thicker. For this next example, I used the gilding gum again. I decided to try pouncing it on quite thickly so that I would get more gum in the body of the circle, not just around the edge. I then sprinkled over that glitter again and I got a much more solid result. You can try this with different types of glue to see which gives you the best result. If you find your glitter rubs off because it's not particularly well stuck in the glue, you can spray it with some kind of fixative. I used a Winsor & Newton fixative, but you can use hairspray, does the same thing. For my next example, I actually sprayed my stencil with repositionable adhesive, and I did this because I wanted the stencil to be really stuck down well to the card. And once it was stuck down well to the card, I spritzed the life out of it with my DIY shimmer spray that's got some pearlized pigment powder in it. And because I sprayed and stuck the stencil down, that shimmer spray shouldn't leak underneath the stencil, it should stay in the circles. And that's what happened. For the most part, I was able to peel off my stencil and I got some nice pearlized circles. What I did with this next one was I sprayed the stencil with repositionable adhesive and stuck it to my card. Then I sprayed everything with repositionable adhesive again so that the circles were sticky. Then I brushed over some white pearl pigment powder from Cosmic Shimmer. I used a cheap makeup brush to do this. Once I was happy with the coverage, I sprayed it again with the fixative. So there's a lot of spraying going on here. But when I pulled the stencil away, I got some beautiful shimmery pearlized circles that didn't rub off because I sprayed the fixative on it. For this next example, I put some glycerin on my mat, which is like sticky embossing ink. I then added some white pearl pigment powder to it, mixed it with a blending sponge and then blended it over a panel through a stencil that I'd also used to dry emboss with. And that gave me a lovely pearly shimmery finish. Next, I added some glycerin to an embossing folder. I then ran a piece of coloured cardstock through my die cutting machine with this embossing folder. I then sprinkled over some of that Nuvo shimmering pearl embossing powder, which stuck to the indented circles made by the embossing folder. And I then heated it with my heat tool. So instead of raised circles with pearlized finish on them, I got indented circles with a pearlized finish on them. I then flipped my panel over and used an embossing pen to lay down embossing ink on the raised circles. And I sprinkled over the shimmery pearly embossing powder again and heated it with my heat tool. And that gave me raised circles with a pearlized finish. So that's a bunch of extra ways of creating that dry embossed plus pearlized heat embossed look. I do hope you've enjoyed the video and it's given you a few ideas. If it has, please do let me know in the comments. Leave a thumbs up, subscribe, ring the notification bell, all those good things, and I'll see you back here very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.